Good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin Butterfield. I'm the Executive Director of the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. Welcome. On behalf of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and our sponsor for this evening and for a monthly book talk every month, the Ford Motor Company, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited for you to be here for an hour listening to a conversation about a remarkable book. I'm actually not going to be a part of that conversation. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's event and then sit back and watch. We do have a couple of upcoming events that I want to mention to you before we get started. One is on this week, on November 19th, we actually have a 4 o'clock event that will be in a partnership with Monticello, exploring new frontiers in early American history. Andrew O'Shaughnessy, the director of the library there, will join me in conversation with a total of 4 research fellows that have worked at one or both institutions, younger scholars doing exciting, cutting-edge work in the field of early American history. Join us on November 19th at 4 o'clock. Also, next month's Ford Evening Book Talk will be on Thursday, December 10th, where Dr. Jean Baker will come to discuss her new book on Latrobe, the great architect in early America, Building America. That'll be in conversation with Dr. Susan Shelware of Mount Vernon. Tonight's exciting program is a discussion focused on this book, First and Always, A New Portrait of George Washington by Dr. Peter Henriques. Dr. Henriques is professor of history emeritus at George Mason. He's taught American and Virginia history with a great emphasis on Washington. Some of his great works included A Realistic Visionary, A Portrait of George Washington, a remarkable text and a remarkable introduction to understanding George Washington, as is this book, a great collection of essays that we're excited to hear more about tonight. He has a long history of involvement and support from Mount Vernon, has frequently participated, for instance, in our teacher institutes, where teachers from around the country come to Mount Vernon to learn about George Washington and the world in which he lived. Now, the exciting thing tonight about this conversation that I'm going to step back to observe is that Dr. Henriques will be joined in conversation by a well-known journalist, Brian Lamb, founder, executive chairman, now retired CEO of C-SPAN. There's so much I could say about Brian. I could mention his Presidential Medal of Freedom, the National Humanities Medal, but I'm going to mention that he's a great friend to Mount Vernon, becoming a great friend to me, a remarkable man, excited to enjoy this conversation with Dr. Henriques. Thrilled to have him here tonight to lead our conversation. Brian, I'm going to hand over the floor to you, and you can bring Dr. Henriques onto the stage whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Kevin. And Dr. Henriques, let me start off by asking you about the title of your book. Why did you call it First and Always?
Well, we were debating on what to call it. Actually, I have an editor friend, Mike Dolan, who worked with me, and he came up with the idea in discussion with me. Washington is our first president, but he's always first in our hearts. And so we took the combination of First and Always, and since my book, Realistic Visionary, was a portrait of George Washington, I thought the proper subtitle would be A New Portrait of George Washington. And I hope to convey that he's first in many different ways, and I think will always be first as the unique founder of our country.
A couple things popped right out of your book when I read it. One is you say that George Washington would not be pleased with the book I have written. Why?
George Washington very much wanted to be famous, but he didn't want to be truly known. He had loved the fact that there is a Washington monument that we're speaking about his contributions to the country. But he does not want people to kind of peer behind the curtain and try to figure out what kind of man he was. He would like to be judged strictly on the remarkable contributions he did. But as nosy historians, to the degree that's possible, and I admit right up front that this is not the end-all book to the real George Washington. He will be the most concealed of all the founding fathers, and there's lots that we'll never really know for sure about him. But just like we really can't know exactly how the human brain works, doesn't mean we can't make progress in learning more about it. And I'm convinced we can learn more about George Washington, some of the remarkable records with his letters being published online through the University of Virginia and Mount Vernon, with new techniques, new insights. I do feel we can get a better grasp of this man. And that's what I see this as a step in this direction at the same time recognizing that there is some things we'll simply never know about him.
Second thing that popped up when I read the book was you wear a medallion of George Washington around your neck. Explain what that's all about and why do you do it?
Well, I think the fact that I put this in the book, essentially, I am a great fan of George Washington. There's no question about that. I have great respect and admiration for him because I truly believe he is the absolute indispensable man in the founding of our great nation. I mean, there are two major events in the formation of our country, the winning of independence and the creation of the nation, and the two are not identical. And in both of these dramatic events, he's the central figure. But I said I wear a medallion around him because he has been so influential in my own life, and I have such respect and admiration. But as I try to go on in the third point, I want to look at the man as best I can, warts and all, and this is certainly no hagiography. I list an awful lot of things where I find that Washington doesn't always do the right thing, has certain character flaws. To me, the amazing thing is not that he has flaws or makes mistakes, but despite the flaws and the mistakes, he's able to have such an unparalleled record of accomplishment.
So what was this is a short book, and it's structured in an unusual way in the sense that it's very precise about what you're after. How did you decide to do the book this way?
It essentially the same type of format that I use with Realistic Visionary, as opposed to a full-scale biography, kind of a womb-to-tomb biography like Ron Chernow's remarkable Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Washington. I found that if you take a specific aspect of Washington, you can spend the time on it in a way that you simply can't do in a full-scale biography. And one of the joys of being retired is I can pick topics that are of interest to me. If I want to explore his relationship with his mother, for example, I'll spend time and emphasis on that. If I want to figure out my judgment of what made him a great leader, I'll work on that. So it's essentially, I had a number of different ideas. I was very fortunate to be asked to go to Colonial Williamsburg to give a distinguished lecture series a number of years ago. And they've invited me back for 2 or 3 talks at least each year. And as I've been doing these talks, I've come up with new ideas. And I finally reached the point where I said, I think I have enough new material to merit trying to share these insights in a new book. But it's the advantage of this book is that you can go right to chapter 5 if that's what you want to read. Each chapter stands on its own, but I hope taken together they give a fuller picture of this remarkable man.
Go back to the days at the University of Virginia when you were there, and tell us what you learned then that spurred you on to be a George Washington historian and the founding fathers.
Well, I was in I hate to admit this because it shows how old I am, but I was at the University of Virginia in the 1960s, late 1960s. Believe it or not, we wore sport coats to class. And in those years, Jefferson, all things Jefferson really were holy. He was the absolute, this was before the Sally Hemings story, before the emphasis on the tragedies in connection with racism and slavery that become center stage. So I left the University of Virginia with a profound admiration for Jefferson. I still have many positive feelings towards him. But when I got the position at George Mason University, I was actually hired as a local historian, and I was to start a new local history journal, Northern Virginia Heritage. And since Washington was a Northern Virginian, we made that our center point, and that's what really got me going into Washington. I did not study Washington much at all when I was in graduate school. But when I started to study Washington, I found out my image of him is kind of a remote, distant, hard to understand figure, that not really a forceful personality. I don't know if we could put up the slides of the first bust of George Washington, the remarkable bust of Washington by Houdon. if you look at this picture, this is the Washington of life. If you look at this picture, this is a man. I tried to do the same thing on the cover of my book. I think UVA Press did a wonderful job of kind of focusing on what type, the forcefulness of his personality. Houdon was the great French sculptor, really the Michelangelo of the 18th century. He came all the way from France, spent a week at Mount Vernon. This is a live mask, a live bust based on a live mask. Washington went through the discomfort of having a live mask made. This is as close as we'll get to the real man. And Houdon is trying to show Washington as a man passionate, but controlling his passion. If you look closely at the bust, you'll see his right eye slightly raised, his nostrils slightly flared, his lips pursed together, like he's in anger. But the topography of the face doesn't show any creases. He's got his anger under control. And I found that this man, this was not the man I expected. Back to your specific point about Jefferson, as I studied Washington, I learned that in fact, Washington came to see Jefferson ultimately as a deceitful man and broke relationships with him. They did have a very close relationship for a long, long time. But as a result of some of the friction and different views when Washington was president and Jefferson Secretary of State, Washington ultimately came to have very negative views about Jefferson.
When did you get the idea to do a chapter called Fractured Friends?
Fractured Friends is a chapter in the book that deals with Washington's breaks, which struck me, and I don't think most people are aware of. There's a tendency to think of the founding fathers sitting around holding hands singing "We Shall Overcome." They're all the same group of men. They're all doing the same good task. But in actual fact, Washington broke with 5 very famous Virginians. 3 of them were presidents: Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. With George Mason, the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the Virginia Constitution, and Edmund Randolph, a second Secretary of State and a very important Attorney General first, and a very important Virginian, was governor of Virginia during the debate over the Constitutional Convention. And Washington ends up ending his relationship with all 5 of these other famous Virginians. And I don't think most people are aware of that. And so I thought it would be kind of interesting to bring this up and to kind of examine why that happened.
Among the 5, it seems like the Jay Treaty played a big role in some of the splits. First, tell us what the Jay Treaty was and why did that lead to so many differences of opinion?
The Jay Treaty really is the absolute dominant force in Washington's second term. It's a treaty with Great Britain. What happened? Great Britain and France were at full-scale war in the aftermath of the French Revolution. And America, as a relatively small country in terms of strength, but active in terms of shipping and commerce, the British were seizing our ships and treating us in a very unfair way. Indeed, Jefferson and the Republicans felt that they needed an embargo against Great Britain to try to force them to treat us more respectfully. Washington was afraid that if we went down the economic warfare with England, we might end up in real warfare with him, which in his judgment would destroy the country. So Washington takes the unprecedented step and precedent-setting step of sending a special envoy, John Jay, who, by the way, was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time. That raised some interesting questions. Jay went to Great Britain, did get a peace treaty, which meant that we would be not going down to war. England won favored nation status. That was good news. The treaty gave America very, very little. And if you'll remember, we're so sympathetic to Great Britain now. At the time, we had finished a war with Great Britain. France had been our great ally. Great Britain was the enemy. And many people felt that the Jay Treaty essentially was a sellout of American interest to Great Britain. Washington was really viewed as just a toady of Great Britain. The Anglo men of America sold out sold out the country. And the Republican Party, led by Madison and Jefferson and James Monroe, who was our ambassador to France, was absolutely outraged by the treaty and condemned it. Washington essentially, the word appeasement is always a tricky word, but Washington felt that sometimes this country needed 10 years of peace in order to be able to strengthen itself. And he was willing to put up with a lousy deal rather than have a clash. And most historians judge that he did the right thing. At the time, many people felt it was a sellout of America's interest. And that's really what led, in the cases of Jefferson and Monroe and Madison, those three men, really it was the anger at Jay's Treaty that led them to do certain things which caused Washington to break with them.
This is a little bit off the subject, but you taught at George Mason, and he doesn't seem to be that well known around the United States today. If you come to Washington and go down on the Mall, hidden, as you know, behind the tidal basin there, and that on the other side where Jefferson is a small monument to George Mason and a statue. You don't find anything in this town with Adams. President Adams is nowhere to be found in the statue. Why George Mason? Why is he getting that attention, and why isn't he getting more? Because he's one of your fractured friends in this book, nationwide.
Well, George Mason really did. He's a very important founding father in the sense that he's the chief author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which precedes Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. If you read the Bill of Rights, it's almost like few sections are almost plagiarized by Jefferson. And he is also the chief author of the Virginia Constitution. But George Mason, unlike Washington, Mason is truly a reluctant statesman. He does not like public life. He doesn't save his papers. All the papers combined from George Mason comprise only 3 volumes, as opposed to what will be over 90 volumes for the Washington papers. He's not interested in politics. And of course, he opposed the Constitution, primarily because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. So he was on the losing side of history along that line. And as a result, I mean, it's a big step forward that he has a small monument. He had nothing for a long, long time. Very brief story. When I became a professor at George Mason University in local history, a New York firm called up. They were going to do some things for George Mason, and the person on the phone said, "I'd like to speak to either Peter Henriques or George Mason." Well, I could come to the phone a lot easier than George Mason, so I took the call. But to me, it's an indication of just how little George Mason was known. The best thing for George Mason University is when they got to the Final Four in basketball. That happened to be the same time I came out with my book, Realistic Visionary. And then George Mason, since then, has gotten, at least the university, has gotten a lot wider recognition.
I want to encourage those watching to ask questions. We can go to them in 4 or 5 minutes if we have questions. But go back to the chapter on fractured friends. What was the direct reason that George Mason and George Washington fell out?
The main reason was over the Constitution. I think we need basically to realize that Washington could disagree with people and remain very good friends. I mean, Benjamin Harrison, who opposed the Constitution, Washington writes him a very nice letter. It has no impact on our friendship. He understood men of goodwill can see things differently. But in the case of George Mason, Washington came to believe, whether it was fair or not, that's debatable, that George Mason not only opposed the Constitution, but he opposed the Constitution in what Washington felt was an unfair way by attacking the character of the people supporting it. And Washington felt that essentially Mason's view was, since he couldn't get what he wanted, in his fit of pique, he decided to oppose the Constitution and attack the character of some of the founders. The one thing with George Washington, you could disagree with him, but he's extremely sensitive to any attacks on his character or his sense of honor. And he interpreted Mason's attack this way and therefore broke relationships with him.
Why did he fall out with James Madison?
Madison is so important in the early story of Washington. I mean, for the first years, James Madison's the indispensable man in the very early years of Washington's presidency, as Alexander Hamilton is for the second part. And Madison and Washington had such admiration for Madison. He had very close feelings towards him as they worked together in the Constitution. He actually writes a letter to Madison urging him to come to Mount Vernon, take time off, rest, be with me, and relax. But in the aftermath of Jay's Treaty, which, as I indicated, the Republicans despised, and one of the terms of the Jay's Treaty required money to be raised by Congress to deal with some of the disputed fisheries and things of that nature. Madison's view was, since the House of Representatives pays the money, they're entitled to view the papers that led to the treaty. And Madison leads the move to demand that the papers are given to the House. Washington's position was the House has nothing to do with treaties. The Constitution makes clear that treaties are to be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. Jay's treaty was ratified by exactly 2/3 of the Senate by a vote of 20-10. And Washington used executive privilege and said that he would not do it. And he felt, Washington, again, I think maybe not fairly, but felt that Madison was questioning his integrity and interpretation in a way that caused him to break his relationship with it. It was not as dramatic as it was with Jefferson, but he never invited Madison to any more personal private dinners. He never mentions Madison after he dies, after his presidency in the rest of his life. Madison always thought highly of Washington. It's kind of interesting. I mean, George Mason never said anything negative about Washington either. And Madison has written some wonderful assessments of him. To me, it's one of the saddest chapters because I have great admiration for Madison and his contributions to the founding of the nation.
What led to, I know that James Monroe had a falling out with him, but what led to Monroe criticizing publicly Washington?
Well, Monroe was our ambassador to France, and at the time of the Jay's Treaty. You know, if you're an ambassador and you're undermining your government's position, you can't be too surprised if the government decides to recall you. From Monroe's point of view, he saw the Jay's Treaty as such a sellout of America. And he really felt, he wrote a letter, it actually wasn't a public letter, he never sent it, but it's in his records, where he writes and essentially says that Washington, in your early years, you worked to give freedom to the country. In your later years, you've moved to enslave it. I mean, there's actual words that he used. And he writes a long, very long, titled and long book on his experience, in which he rakes over the Washington administration and criticizes Washington. And Washington, who's so sensitive to criticism, the book really didn't have much impact on the public. But Washington got a copy of the book, and in a way that he did not do with any other piece of writing, wrote a large amount of marginalia criticizing different points in the book in a very sharp, sarcastic way. The editors of the Washington paper say it's the most sarcastic type of criticism that Washington ever put down on paper, almost as if he was wounded by Monroe and he had to go out against him. And kind of sadly, the last political thing that Washington did the night before he died was to criticize the news that Monroe had been elected with Madison's help, to be the new governor of Virginia. Washington died the day after he was reading those newspapers and being very bitter about it. It's kind of a sad end to the relationship.
Did the public know at the time of the fractured relationship between Thomas Jefferson and George Washington?
Yes, they did know, not initially, but Washington. What happened? Thomas Jefferson wrote a private letter to an Italian friend, Philip Mazzei, in which he referred to Washington as an apostate to republicanism. You know, an apostate, one who used to be a member of the faith and has now left it. That was a perfectly private letter, but through a set of circumstances I don't have time to go into, it gets public, and Washington reads that. You know, if there's anything that George Washington would despise, is for someone to challenge him as apostate to Republican values, which he dedicated his life and risked his life over and over to protect. And in the election of 1800, when Thomas Jefferson is running against John Adams in the remarkably close election, which had some of the nasty overtones that we just experienced in 2020, this letter, the Mazzei letter, became widely used public as an attack that the Federalists used against Jefferson. He attacked Washington, who had just died months before the beginning of the electoral campaign.
Again, anybody have questions, send them in and we will pass them on to Professor Henriques. You have a chapter called Myths, and I'll list them. The cherry tree, his wooden teeth, praying at Valley Forge, a great cursor, a cold and humorless man, a womanizer, the father of West Ford, Washington power and presidential precedents, the presidential oath, a figurehead president, the tradition of the two-term presidency. What was your idea in the myth chapter? Why did you think that was going to be interesting to a public?
Well, I think I did it primarily because Washington is so encrusted with myths. One of the most frustrating things to me is that people tend to see him as kind of a wooden figure, not a flesh and blood, passionate person, and not someone that one can relate to. You know, think of the monuments. Look at the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial. These men breathe life. Andrew Jackson's horse breathes fire. And there's the Washington Monument, you know, big but cold and without any sense of human flesh. So a lot of this comes from people giving myths about Washington that make him into this person who is kind of this goody-goody, two-shoe kind of person who cannot tell a lie. The concept of this prayer at Valley Forge, and a number of other myths about Washington that, like he could have been king and so on and so forth, that I felt if we scrape those away, like he has one of the ones that he's colorless, has no sense of humor. Washington certainly is not, you know, a comedian by any sense of the word, but he enjoys a good laugh and sense of humor under the right circumstances. I quote a couple of rather ribald stories that he tells, and it misinterprets these myths, keep us from understanding the man. He doesn't need myths. The man by himself is impressive enough. But many people think he started the two-term tradition. He didn't, philosophically. Many people said he started the oath, "So help me God," at the end of his inaugural oath. He did not. And many people think that was the father of West Ford. And it's clear to me, absolutely clear, that this is not accurate. So in the book, I try to give the evidence as to why I reached the conclusions that I did.
What's the background on West Ford? And was the story known at the time?
Story was not known at the time. West Ford was born around 1784 or 1785. There's a big debate as to when he was born. If he was born in 1784, George Washington could not have been his father, because Washington was off at war. West Ford had nothing to do with Mount Vernon. In all of Washington's correspondence, he's never mentioned, never comes to Mount Vernon, and neither does his mother, Venus. Venus is a slave of Washington's brother, his favorite brother, John Augustine Washington, who lived at Bushfield. And Washington's brother has this slave, Venus. Now, there's no question that West Ford is a very important and interesting figure and a remarkable man. My own guess is, which I develop as best I can in the book and can't go into all the story now, he's probably the son of one of Washington's nephews. John Augustine Washington had 3 sons: Bushrod Washington, who becomes a member of the Supreme Court, Corbin Washington, and a young son, Augustine Washington, who sadly is killed by an accident at college where a friend is fooling with a gun and shoots and kills him. The best guess is that he was the father of Venus's child, because when John Augustine Washington dies, his wife makes every effort to be sure that West Ford will be trained in a trade and vaccinated against smallpox and freed at the age of 21. He has Washington family blood in him. I think over time, myself, what happened is that the story that he was descended from Washington's family moves that he was descended directly from George Washington. The amount of evidence to support that is just remarkably limited. It's a real challenge to get Venus and George Washington together for the theoretical possibility that he could be the father, and why he would dally with his brother's slave on a one-night visit to Mount Vernon. It doesn't make any sense, and there isn't any answer. I go into it in more detail in the book. I understand people can believe, obviously, whatever they want to on this story. My own personal view is, honestly, Washington had no children, black or white. He was most likely sterile. And one of the reasons why, much as he wanted children with Martha, he was never able to have them.
One of the myths is the teeth. And I don't want to ask you about the normal teeth stories. Everybody knows the kids are running right to the teeth when they get to Mount Vernon. And I've never seen a book on it. I've tried to find one. What was it like, the fact that George Washington didn't have any teeth and wore, false teeth, and that John Adams didn't have any teeth? And I've not been able to see if he even wore false teeth. And what would it have been like back then? And were there a lot of other founders that didn't have teeth?
Well, you're getting into an area where I don't feel very comfortable on, certainly as far as the other founding fathers. Washington suffered from bad teeth throughout his life. He had, by the time he became president, there was only one left in his mouth, and that came out, and he had this really rather uncomfortable contraption that was put in. It caused him a lot of trouble. There's no doubt about that. And he, I would say, as far as how common it was, I don't know. There is, of course, the question of Washington and teeth, and they weren't made out of wood; they were made out of ivory, hippopotamus ivory, cow, and some teeth from humans. He actually purchased some teeth from his slaves, and this has become a kind of a hot button issue that we could talk about if you wanted to.
Well, let me go to another part of the book, if you don't mind. And I wrote this down. You say that he was very sensitive to criticism. And you also say that he was deeply ambitious, massively concerned with his reputation, in regular search of an adoring public's approbation. Sounds like a narcissist.
I don't see Washington as a narcissist. He certainly has a very strong ego, and there is no question in my mind that Washington does essentially see in time when he becomes commander-in-chief, he had a unique, uncommon awareness of himself right from the time that he was born, that he did have a special role. And he does see himself, in my judgment, as a special figure, really called by Providence. He's not God's lieutenant, that God speaks to him and he speaks to people, but he does feel that a good Providence has protected him. Washington is in danger so many different times in his life. David Humphreys once wrote him a letter and said, you're the luckiest man in the world. And then he said, or perhaps to put it more properly, that Providence has protected and guided you over your life. He is a man who deeply desires secular immortality. And one of the undoubtedly more controversial parts of my book is the last chapter, where I do argue that Washington desires public applause while he's alive to receive it, even though he would certainly disagree with that assessment.
So the mother relationship. When did his father die?
His father died in 1743. Washington was born in 1732, so he was only 11 years old. And Washington was the eldest child of his father's second marriage. His father's first wife, Jane Butler, had died. He had two sons, Lawrence, who inherited Mount Vernon, and Augustine. So 60% of the estate that his father owned went to his sons by his first marriage. And Washington's mother Washington was the eldest of five children, that she was in a very difficult situation she never remarried for debatable reasons. And she brought these five children up by herself. That was a very difficult thing to do. Very often in those days, when you had a number of children, they would be parceled out. Think that when Jackie Custis dies, two of the children, Nellie and George Washington Parke Custis, are taken and brought up by Washington. Jack had four children. The two youngest went with Washington and Martha. Here, Washington's mother, it's quite a tribute that she was able to raise these five children and keep them all together. She's a very interesting, controversial. Most historians are very negative about her, and there are some genuinely negative things that one can say. But I entitle my chapter "Complicated, Very Complicated," because it's a crucial relationship. And I think it helped Washington in many ways. I think it left him with some scars in other ways, which I can touch on if you want.
Sure, go ahead.
I think essentially what happens is Washington becomes the man of the house at the age of 11 years old. And that's a heavy burden to put on anyone. His mother is needy and demanding. She's strong-willed, hard to satisfy, very skimpy with praise. And Washington is by far her favorite child, and she wants him to focus on her needs. And Washington is very ambitious not to just do that. So there is this clash. But to me, one of the interesting things to realize, Washington wins the support of many famous Virginia men, led by people like William Fairfax and Governor Dinwiddie and others. And he would not have been able to win the support of these people if he had been an oaf, if he had not had integrity, if he was not hardworking, and so on. I think we owe his mother a debt for bringing him up that way. And if you're happy with the American story, Lawrence Washington and William Fairfax encouraged George to join the British Navy at the age of 15. If he had done that, of course, our history would have been totally different. He didn't do it because his mother would not allow him to do so. And she stood up to some strong-willed men It showed what a strong-willed woman she was herself.
So over the years, you've written how many books about George Washington?
I guess 4 books and quite a few articles.
When you think of the research you've done, can you give us a couple moments where you said, wow, I did not know that, and you knew that you had something special?
That's a hard question to answer off the top of my head. There's no question I've discovered things that I did not know and found interesting. One of the chapters in my book is on the Askill affair, which is a little known incident where Washington comes remarkably close to executing a British captain who had surrendered at Yorktown in retaliation for the killing of an American militia captain. And I knew relatively little about that, ended up getting into some deep research, actually had good contact with a lady who's now a friend in England, Anne Amundsen, who's knows more about Askill than anyone on the planet, and sharing different material. My hope for that story is it's got all the makings, if you read chapter 4, of a wonderful miniseries for TV, either British or American television. If I had a wish in my final years, it is to find someone to develop this very dramatic story, a little bit like Turn would be, only this is much more grounded on historical evidence. We know a lot about it. That was a very interesting chapter. It's sometimes I've just kind of things as I've thought about different things, and I realized, well, like the shadow self, for example, I had no idea. That's the last chapter where I argue that Washington does have a part of him that wants this public adulation while he's alive to enjoy it. I think that is an insight that can help us understand him. I know it's controversial, and whenever you go into psychohistory, you do it with a great deal of caution. A lot of it's psychobabble, and maybe I saw one review on Amazon that referred to that. He liked the book. He said, but the last chapter was psychobabble. I don't think it is, but I can understand why people would say that. But I've just enjoyed getting, as I looked at material, his relations with Sally Fairfax. By reading some of the things, I've gotten, I think, better insights in the way he felt about her than most people would have had.
What did he feel about her?
She was his first love, and this is a fascinating story. There's actually, I have a chapter on it to plug my other book, Realistic Visionary. One of the chapters is on Sally Carey Fairfax and their relationship. I should hasten to add that when he marries Martha, they have a very good, solid, loving relationship, and Martha Washington is certainly the most important woman in his life. But it's interesting when I was looking at some of the things, like when after Sally Carey Fairfax and her husband go to England and they sell their place Belvoir, Washington buys some of her furniture to put in his own bedroom. He writes a letter to her when he goes to see Belvoir after it had been burned out. He said, I have so many wonderful memories there. I had to flee. And indeed, he writes a letter near the end of his life, which he includes a letter from Martha with his letter to make clear. But he says, of all the things in my life, essentially, I can't remember the exact wording now, but that relationship with you was absolutely central to it. But in terms of luck, I think if Sally Fairfax had encouraged him to do something desperate, if he had actually ended up having an affair with her, his whole career would have been ruined. And part of me wonders that if she had encouraged him, whether in fact he would have done that. And again, American history would have been very different.
If you were to meet him, what do you think he'd be like?
He'd probably he certainly looked down at me. I'm 5, he's 6'2.5", and I'm 5'6", and I have to stretch to that sometimes as I get older. I think my own feeling probably would be that he'd be fairly cold and reserved. Washington is a distant person. He's an elitist by temperament. Yeah, if he could be remarkably open and friendly. That's why people who visit Mount Vernon, they have very different views. So many people visited him. If he thinks you're questioning him or on the other side of the political fence, so to speak, he could be always polite and nice, but not warm. But with friends, and he enjoyed his Madeira, he could be very, very much at ease and really a very likable person with a sense of humor at certain times. So my guess is if he met me, and as I said, if he had read my book, he would be not pleased with parts of it. He'd be pleased with parts of it, but not pleased with other.
How hard is it as a historian to be negative at all about George Washington?
You know, there's always a danger whenever you devote as much time as I have to any one man. You sometimes either get to really like him or really dislike him, and it shapes all your judgment about him. You know, I wear the medallion around him. It's easy, you know, sometimes like you have societies, the Aaron Burr Society, or maybe I don't. In some societies that you can't, the man can't do anything. You're always defending. As a University of Virginia graduate, I love the quote from Jefferson. Said, "Here we're not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, or tolerate error as long as truth is able to combat it." And my view as an historian, I want to know as best I can what the truth is. And sometimes, like in the Askill affair, it ends up that he makes a bad judgment, or the way he treated Edmund Randolph, or when he was commander-in-chief when John Adams was president, he didn't treat Adams very well. Sometimes he mistreated his slaves. If that's the way it is, it's my obligation to do it. I know the trouble with that is that people who are looking for flaws in Washington will only take these things and say Washington did this or did that, without recognizing all the remarkably positive things that are also in the book. And on balance, you know, this man is truly one of the most remarkable men that ever lived. There would be no America without George Washington. I mean, I honestly believe that. We would very likely be a series of confederacies, maybe 5 or 6 different nations, much like Europe. It was Washington's stature, his vision, his remarkable political skills that got us through that early trying time. Of course, we came very close to breaking up anyway over slavery, and we haven't touched on that yet, but that obviously is extremely sensitive and tricky subject in connection with Washington.
I'm not sure about the numbers, but when Mount Vernon, the home, is open and we're not in the middle of COVID, there's about 1 million people that visit there every year. I think only 3 million people around when he was president. What do you think he would think if he came back, saw what's going on in the country today, saw that big 555-foot monument to him down in the mall, and realized so many people were coming to his home and looking at the education center? What do you think his reaction would be?
I think he would be pleased. He envisioned a great American, a rising empire, as he called it. He had he's an extreme nationalist. I mean, his goal is to envision a growing, powerful United States. So to see that aspect, I mean, obviously, you can imagine anyone coming back and looking at the world and the transportation system and all the things would be just overwhelming. But the concept of his nation growing from the Atlantic to the Pacific and recognizing him in the way that the country has done, that would certainly please him. You know, the idea when he'd look at the political scene, Washington was an old line conservative Republican with a little R. He was not a Democrat with a little d, that the people should be in. Lincoln's famous quote, "We'll save government of the people, by the people, for the people." Washington is fine of the people and for the people. He would not be comfortable with by the people. And the idea that Washington would ever get up and say, "Vote for me," would be unthinkable to him. He wanted people should choose leaders based on their character. The idea of this excessive political campaigning and wheel dealing and so on and so forth, he would not be happy with, and he would probably, shake his head and said, "Oh my God," to some aspects of how the system worked out.
Where are you from originally?
Originally, I'm outside of New York City and grew up in Pelham, New York, near New Rochelle and Mount Vernon, and went to Trinity College in Connecticut, where I met my wife, Marlene. And then I was actually in Yale Divinity School and Princeton Seminary before I went down to Florida to teach at a private school. And then I got really interested in history and went to UVA and became a professor and was lucky enough to get into George Mason.
How many years at George Mason?
I guess about 27. I taught for the University of Virginia Extended Studies program. I didn't get into George Mason my first try, but luckily I had a friend, Dean Brundage, who was the head of the University of Virginia Extended Studies program, and he was able to cobble a job together. I came within an eyelash of leaving academia completely, but he got me this position, and then I taught part-time at George Mason in the summers and happily got some pretty good reviews. And when a new position opened up, I was able to get it. I said it was in local history, which was not my specialty. I had to go back, quickly change my vita and try to shape it in a certain way. But luckily it worked out. And I've had to be a professor at a university is a wonderful, except for the money. It's a dream job.
So what would you more often than not teach, and what year?
I'd always taught the American History Survey up to the Civil War and then beyond the Civil War. I did that on a regular basis. Then I would teach. At one time I taught a course on the Civil War, 20th century American history. I focused more on Virginia history, both up to the present, up to the 1950s in Virginia history. But more and more I got on the Virginia founding fathers and more on Washington. So near the end, I would teach seminars on George Washington, both at undergraduate and in the graduate program, or on Virginia history. But my love and the thing I knew the most about was Washington, and he's endlessly fascinating. I mean, if I live to 120, there's no way you could read all the books or all the letters, and he repays me. We don't have the advantage of having some remarkable person in your house to chit chat with. The best we can do as historians, you connect with someone, and he's got many insights that are very helpful for living life. At the end of my book, I have a little section of quotes on the wisdom of George Washington, and some of those quotes deal with just how to live a good life, and much of that advice to me is as timeless now as it was when he wrote it over 200 years ago.
When did you know that students were really getting interested in George Washington?
Well, I was flattered. My classes always filled up, so that was a good sign.
How many in a class?
Well, the seminars would only be 15 to 20. The broader classes, you'd have up usually about 30. I was happy, the move is towards larger and larger classes, which I guess are all right for lectures. But just like I'm enjoying this virtual presentation, but I wish I could see the people that I'm connecting with. You can, when you're in the classroom, you make human connections with people, and that allows you sometimes, then you sit, they come to the office with a question, and you can can get a better sense of what you're doing. Right now, I don't know how many people are saying, well, this is BS, I'm closing up the shop or whatever. You just don't know. But if it was a live audience, you could see someone's phone rings, someone else is dozing off, and you say, well, maybe I should change the topic or something like that.
But was there a story you would tell about George Washington, and all of a sudden you could see the audience lighting up?
I've certainly one of the stories I remember when I told them that I questioned the validity of the story of him praying at Valley Forge, and one of the students got up and quit the class, said, I'm not going to be subjected to some far left wing professor undermining American values. That's one of the incidents I do remember. But a lot of people, one of the nicest things about being a professor, and for so many years, I have met some of my students just coincidentally. I imagine a few of them are watching this show tonight, and I've stayed in touch with. And sometimes you see someone says, your course inspired me to be a history major at college, and now I'm a teacher at such and such a school. And that is a very nice reward to have people say that I influence their life in a positive way.
We've got a few minutes left, not much time, but if there's a question or two that they want to pop up on my screen, I'd be glad to read it. This was from Stephanie Rennie. I have my government students doing research on the founding fathers right now. Any advice to give to students today? Our founding fathers are so interesting.
Well, it's a good question. I think one of the interesting things might be, if you were doing the founding fathers, I always like the idea of trying to have a debate. Have a student perhaps study George Mason and why he was opposed to the Constitution. How was slavery dealt with at the Constitution? Pick a certain area of interest and focus and have them focus on that. If you get students to try to think on different sides of the coin, debate things, raise the question. I mean, we sometimes in this day and age, there's a tendency with all our Twitter feed and Facebook friends and our certain channels, Fox or MSNBC, we get the same steady focus of one point of view. And really that's dangerous. You need to have people disagreeing with you and taking different positions, a conservative or liberal position, depending on where you are. And I found if I could get students to think critically, that's the key thing, especially in this day and age where, ask Siri. I'm always struck by when my grandkids are around, and I have 12 of them who I dedicated the book to, and I imagine a few of them are watching tonight, hopefully pleased. And they're just so comfortable. I don't need to know that. I can just ask Siri. But thinking critically and analyzing, that's key. And working with the founding fathers with that kind of tool, there are loads of ways that you could do that. Look at the debate in the Virginia convention. There's loads of records on it. It's very interesting. And it was narrowly, major Virginians like Patrick Henry, initially at Edmund Randolph, and Madison, Monroe and others were opposed to the Constitution. It was a very close call. Madison had to use all of his skill to get it through. Look at that kind of debate. Why did people not like it? What were they afraid of? And of course, the slavery issue is always something that is such a key aspect of our life that we need to. You can always get involved in that and raise a lot of questions.
See if we got one more question. Let's see. This from Scarlett Ingstad. What characteristics about Washington's leadership style do you admire the most and that leaders today should study and emulate? This will be our last question.
Okay. I think I have a chapter on Washington's leadership, my first chapter. If I could see slide 2, I basically list 10 factors that were in Washington's combining together to make him into a great leader. He was very lucky, physicality, I mean, he looked the part of a leader. You can't ignore that. He's tremendously ambitious. His determination, he's got an amazing will, the enormous force of his will. He's a passionate man. He controls his passion, but he's a passionate man. He's tough. You have to be tough to be a top leader. A remarkable courage. His philosophy, he understood human nature. He understood he's not an idealist by any means. He has many talents, from great memory, understanding power, ability of judgment, and last but not least, he's got the character. The Greeks judged character as a combination of 4 traits: courage, wisdom, prudence, and justice. And when you look at these qualities and compare them in Washington's life, he is a man of the utmost character. So this amazing combination at the right time, take any of those away, and it would be a problem. And as I said at the beginning, in some ways, he's the luckiest man there is. But thank goodness, if we're happy that we're the United States of America, that these factors coalesced in one man at the right time to give the American experiment a chance. As we see today, it's always an experiment and it can fail. But we have managed because of we've been given the chance, thanks to Washington. How we use it is up to us. Thanks for your attention.
Dr. Peter Henriques has this book. You can see it right there, First and Always. It's short, to the point, and all about different aspects of George Washington's life. He's retired, has been retired from George Mason University for the last 17 years and lives in Gainesville, Virginia, where he is tonight. And we thank you very much, to you and to our audience, for joining us.
Thanks. It was a pleasure to do this with you, Brian. Thanks so much for hosting me.
My pleasure.